Shalom to everybody from Jerusalem. I'm happy to start the JISS webinar on the Ukraine crisis, causes and implications. Our first speaker is Anna Borshchevskaya. I hope I say it right. And she will speak about the Russian perspective on this crisis, which occupies the mind of many in many capitals of the world, because this crisis reverberates, throughout the world. So Anna, please go ahead.
Thank you.
I want to introduce Anna. I forgot. Sorry. Anna Borshchevskaya is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute. She is working on Russian foreign policy, particularly towards the Middle East. She's also a contributor to Oxford Analytica and a fellow at the European Foundation for Democracy. She was educated got a PhD at George Mason University and SAIS. And her last book was Putin's War in Syria. We are again at war.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this introduction. I am going to be as brief as possible to simply lay out a few key points for discussion later on. So the first thing I'd like to start with is that this crisis is manufactured by Russia. This is entirely a manufactured crisis rather than a situation born out of real concerns. And my second point is that it is about a lot more than just Ukraine. In my book, one of the points I make is that the Syria intervention was not really about Syria. Russia's Syria intervention was not really about Syria. And in the same vein, this crisis is not really about Ukraine. Of course, it involves Ukraine also, but it's much bigger than that. At the heart of the issue is that our fundamental worldviews, Western worldviews and Russian worldview are coming to a clash. For the Kremlin, this is about fundamentally changing the post-Cold War world order. When we in the West won the Cold War, we moved on and everybody assumed that this very hard-won battle was finished. But a number of people in then Soviet Union did not see it that way, and they're now in charge. So what they're trying to do is go back and basically play out the Cold War with an alternate ending. The Kremlin's fundamental problem is that it cannot live in a US-like global order. We have fundamentally different views on issues such as state sovereignty. The idea that and the West believes that these ideas are universal. The Russian state does not. One of the lesser known comments from Vladimir Putin, and he's known for a lot of comments, but one of the lesser ones is that few states possess true sovereignty. And this view that there are only certain states that have true sovereignty, and in this, by the way, he did not even include Europe. He talked about the United States, Russia, China, and India, and perhaps several other countries, but he did not even mention European countries on that list. And so this shows you a very different worldview, a view where there are great powers that matter, and then small states that have to conform to a sphere of influence. And this view is fundamentally coming, these conflicting worldviews are coming to a clash. This is why for years we've been hearing Russian state officials decry the rules-based global order, which they feel is imposed upon them by the West. Okay, so why now? Why now? And there are many reasons for this, both short-term and long-term. For many years, the Kremlin has come to conclude that on many issues, the West is weak and that it is far more risk averse than the Russian state. Again, this is something that didn't just happen 1 or 2 years ago. It's a continual trend, but specifically in the last year, two very big things happened. And that is the Biden administration lifted sanctions against Nord Stream 2, which is Russia's main geopolitical project in Europe. And the United States has completely mishandled the withdrawal from Afghanistan. American credibility took a tremendous hit, and you could see Russian commentators, even in the most polite of terms, basically saying that American global credibility is, if not gone, then it's taking a severe hit. In fact, one commentator said that even when the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, at least the government held for a short period of time. So both, and on top of which you have lots of other issues going on in Russia. Putin is probably thinking about his legacy. There's a whole host of other things going on, which we can get into more detail in the Q&A. But perception of the West as weaker and risk averse is the key to what's happening here. Putin is using all elements of coercion, of state power. It's a whole of government approach. Whereas the West is mostly focused on discussion about sanctions, first and foremost, in case of an incursion, and also provision of military aid to Ukraine. The other point I want to mention briefly is whether or not Putin has backed himself into a corner with this situation. This has been a very long, very, very vibrant debate, very heated debate. In recent weeks, whether or not Putin has no choice but to act militarily at this stage in Ukraine. I will say that that there's lots of good arguments on either side. I feel that he has not quite backed himself into a corner just yet, but he very well may. The reasons for that is because domestically, for example, the way the Kremlin has spun this narrative to the Russian audience is that it is the West that is pushing Russia towards a war and conflict, and Russia does not want war. And if you look at opinion polls, unfortunately, they reflect that a fairly large portion of the Russian population does believe this erroneous idea that ultimately it is the West that is pushing Russia towards a confrontation. Another issue is that I think the Kremlin ideally would like to conduct a limited incursion rather than a full-scale invasion, because at this stage, this Russia is very different from the Soviet Union. This Russia actually wants to avoid heavy casualties and heavy costs. And we've seen that in Syria. Syria was designed precisely to avoid a quagmire. But even a limited incursion will have tremendous implications. And it can happen very quickly. We cannot think that just because it's not a full-scale invasion but a limited incursion, it's not a problem. Lastly, and I will end there in the interest of saving time, what it ultimately comes down to is whether or not we can deter Russia effectively. Because what Putin is trying to do is scare everybody into a dialogue on his terms. And he has achieved that. Unlike other previous buildups around Ukraine, this one is clearly far more serious. And the West is taking it seriously. And the very fact that for the first time, the West is taking it as seriously as it has is already a kind of win for him. What concerns me the most is that we will end up making concessions of sorts. That would be the worst thing possible, because it will not end with Ukraine. Encouragement of aggression like that never ends there, and we've seen that in history. We're talking about a desire to fundamentally restructure the European security architecture, and that will have global implications. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for your brief comments. I want to point out that I'm not Tuvia Gering, I'm Efraim Inbar, despite the fact that this is a name written there. Tuvia, say hello to everybody so they'll know who you are. And please, if you have questions, use the chat function, and we'll try to accommodate your questions at the end of the, before the end of the session. Now we'll move to the Ukrainian crisis. It's my pleasure to introduce Lieutenant Colonel retired, I presume, Oleksiy Melnyk, a pilot, a squadron commander, and he now serves as co-director of foreign relations and international security programs and coordinator of international projects at the Razumkov Center. It's your floor. Unmute yourself. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure and responsibility to present Ukrainian point of view, despite I probably not in a position to speak on behalf of Ukraine. That's basically my version of the truth that I'm going to share with you. First of all, we are talking about the current crisis, which is, of course, didn't start yesterday, and I'm afraid is not gonna to end in a foreseeable future. Half a year ago, Ukraine celebrated 30 years of its independence, and Razumkov Center did a study and published in this rather wide book. So one of the chapters that I contributed has a insert which is called 30-year history of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So it's a 30-year of the new history of Ukraine being an independent country. And when we look back, it's basically from the very first day of independence, there was a conflict. 80 years ago, it erupted or developed into the armed conflict. But it's very important to keep in mind that from the very first day of independence, there were the same reasons that finally brought us to the situation that we have nowadays. And if you ask me to just name one, the most powerful reason for this conflict, I mean, for the current stage of this conflict, it has a real name, and its name or his name is Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Because despite many conflict situations that we had before 2014, Ukraine and Russia leadership always managed to not to bring it to the violent stage. Just one example, for instance, on 29th of December 2003, Russia stopped building a dam on Tuvia Island. I don't know whether this name tells you anything, Tuvia Island. But Russia applied the same hybrid tactics using its Cossacks, Ministry of Emergency Forces, not military forces, but it tried to annex an Ukrainian island Tuvia by building a dam, and it would stop 100 meters before Ukrainian border with some demonstration of force, but without real military conflict. So just one example. So now we have, and I said, if you ask me for one single, the most decisive reason is Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. If you want more answers to the question, read his articles, listen to his speech, because the president of Russia denies the right of Ukraine to exist as an independent country. And our previous speaker, Anna, described this issue of different limits for sovereignty. That's exactly what Putin actually is asking Ukraine to accept as a compromise, to accept the Russian offer to become a part of Russian sphere of influence. And this is kind of model that the Soviet Union practiced during decades of the Cold War in Eastern Europe. There are other reasons why Russia has attacked Ukraine and why this conflict is not over. Ukraine, surprisingly, presents an existential challenge for Russia. Not for Russia as a nation, not for Russia as a state, but for the Russian regime. Because Putin is ready to do everything possible not to let Ukraine to present an alternative model to the Russian society. Because Russians are not very happy with their internal developments, especially with this COVID pandemic. By the way, last year, Russia lost 1 million people due to many reasons, including pandemic. So there is a very terrible economic, demographic situation in Russia. But there is one very powerful answer to all the problems, all the complaints that Russians have. Vladimir Vladimirovich always say, do you want to live like in Ukraine? Of course, now this is like kind of a universal answer. If you imagine that one day Russians would say, perhaps, why not? So if Ukraine developed or makes successful reforms, make a life better than rank and file Russians, then the Putin's regime is going to get in deep trouble, because we still, despite the war, we still have very good people-to-people communication. Of course, there are other geopolitical reasons. Anna mentioned some of them, because Ukraine at the same time is a target for the Russian aggression. It's a battlefield of the bigger war which Russia conducts with the West. Anna mentioned Syria. We can mention other like Balkans. We should watch closely what is going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where also this like growing bloc between anti-American bloc between Russia and China and Iran as well. So this is Ukrainian crisis is the part of the biggest scale geopolitical crisis, which definitely already has and will have more implications for Ukraine, first of all, because Ukraine suffers a lot. In addition to human casualties, it's also a huge burden for the Ukrainian economy, because Ukraine currently has to spend 5.5% GDP on its security and defense, and is struggling with all the economic problems. It's quite a significant burden. There are some positive implications for Ukraine, surprisingly, but I can talk about this later on. There are also implications for Russia. Yesterday, for instance, there was a news in Russian media that one of the Russian generals, retired generals, made a statement like asking Putin not to fight or not to start the war with Ukraine, because I mean, this is the general I mentioned. He probably the last thing that one can accuse him is in his anti-Russian position. He's a great Russian nationalist and patriot, but even for him, it's clear that the possible war with Ukraine will mean the end of Russia as the current state. So there is a big threat of implication, of very strategic implication, negative implications for Russia. And of course, there are implications in global and regional dimension, because in case if Putin's make this decision, which we believe any reasonable person will not do, then Ukraine of course will suffer the most, but there will be implications for regional security. I'm not talking about refugees of Ukraine, but in case if this next wave of sanctions implemented against Russia, and I don't want to waste your time to elaborate what's gonna happen, but definitely we will find ourselves next days in a very difficult and less secure world than we have it even now. So I will stop here and will be happy to answer your questions, if any.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to the American perspective, to be delivered by an Israeli, Colonel retired Dr. Eran Lerman. He is Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He was Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the National Security Council in the Israel's Prime Minister office, held senior posts in the IDF military intelligence for over 20 years. He also served as Director of the Israel and the Middle East Office of the American Jewish Community. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and a mid-career MPA from Harvard University. Eran, it's your floor.
Well, I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, in 10 minutes.
Okay.
It's quite a challenge for Eran.
Yeah, true enough. I'm very glad Anna set out the argument that what Putin is challenging is, in fact, the post-45 and post-Cold War order, because for the Biden administration, of course, this is the Holy Grail, building back better the, I called it in one essay, back to modernity, back to modern times in the post-war and post-Cold War era, when the United States essentially presided over something called the free world. And of course, the Soviet collapse, there was an unquestioned hegemony, not only of the United States, strategically speaking, but also of the ideas it represented. And the Biden administration set out to basically retrieve that position that they believed or argued that the Trump attitude towards allies undermined, but also to do this from a position of moral superiority, speaking on behalf of democracy worldwide. And I think there's a sort of vague link between the present crisis and the summit for the virtual summit for the democracies that was held in December, in the sense that it more or less defined a world divided between the countries that the United States approves of and the countries that it does not, which included at the time not only Russia, China, and Iran, but also Turkey, etc. And basically, this is a challenge to Biden's worldview, and this is why he is being pressed at the ideological level to react in a robust manner. There are also strategic reasons for this. Let's say it's clear, again, that Putin is out not only to bite off a piece of Ukraine, if not control the politics of Kyiv, but also to undermine the unity of NATO. So the US feels obliged to bring some reinforcements to the eastern edges of NATO, so as to sustain the alliance, although the Ukraine itself, of course, is not covered by Article 5 of the NATO statutes. And at the political level, he is clearly under very heavy fire from Republicans who are basically arguing that following the debacle in Afghanistan and his weak handling of the Iranians in Vienna, he is now again showing a weak hand and basically undermining American deterrence and the American role in world affairs. So for all these three reasons, ideological, strategic, and political, the Biden administration feels obliged to do something, symbolic, more or less, but robust enough to look like a response to the Russian challenge. At the same time, there are very solid reasons for Biden to be cautious. I think there was let's put it like this, he was very frank, unnecessarily so, about the limits of American action when he spoke about a minor incursion, raising a whole, a very legitimate concern, not only in Kyiv, but worldwide, about what kind of a hint is he giving to the Russians. But we have to bear in mind that NATO, first of all, of course, to begin with, nobody wants a global war between nuclear powers over this crisis. Neither Putin nor Biden want to walk to the edge, and therefore there is a need to keep the diplomatic channel open. Secondly, NATO cohesiveness is challenged not only by the possibility of a response that would be perceived as too soft, but also by the possibility of a response that would be perceived as too harsh. Because the most important ally in Europe, of course, today is Germany. And Germany, whether it was under Angela Merkel or now even a bit more so under Olaf Scholz is reluctant to be drawn into a conflict with Russia that would vitiate its economy and could, of course, have a direct effect on gas supply and other specific items. But beyond that, it has sustained a policy of dialogue with Moscow, and so it's acting on a brake. They actually hampered some of the efforts to provide Ukraine with weapons that some countries in Europe were willing to undertake. So Biden has to be cautious also not to err on the side of overreaction or underreaction. He's walking a very narrow path. And finally, I think that's a point that Efraim has made and in his essay and others have pointed out. At the end of the day, it is not in the United States' interest to generate a situation where Russia and China are thrown together beyond retrieve, and Russia essentially becomes step by step becomes an adjunct of Chinese policy. So there's still the need to speak to Putin as Putin. And despite the image of coordination between Russia and China is not going to intervene in support of Russia in Ukraine, and Russia has its own historical interest not to be a Chinese satrapy. And in that space, there's still some room for diplomatic maneuver, given that I would accept Anna's assessment that Putin has not yet made the last and irretrievable commitment to go to war. So the Biden administration is maneuvering carefully, trying to show some muscle to shore up NATO and to signal its anger and displeasure without pushing Putin into that proverbial corner that Anna mentioned.
Thank you, Eran. Now we'll move to Europe. Dr. Emmanuel Navon is a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He is a lecturer in international relations also at Tel Aviv University and at Reichman University. He's also a senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum He graduated from Sciences Po, Paris, and earned his PhD in international relations from the Hebrew University. His recent book is The Star and the Scepter, A Diplomatic History of Israel. Emmanuel, s'il vous plaît. Please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you, Efraim, and thank you for mentioning my book. I was told by my publisher never to miss an opportunity to mention the book, which I see is also on your shelf behind your left shoulder. I'm very honored. So we, as you said, we'll switch now to Europe. I think I'll start with the title of my presentation by saying that there is no European stance on the Ukrainian crisis. I mean, as always with the EU, you have platitudes coming out of Brussels and decisions made essentially in Berlin and Paris, since London is no longer on the list. But on the Ukrainian crisis, I think Berlin is mostly absent and Paris is essentially wary. Until a couple of months ago, Germany was run by the towering figure of Angela Merkel. She had the respect of Vladimir Putin, although she despised him for his thuggishness and his lies. But Merkel's successor, Olaf Scholz, is not only uncharismatic and bland, he has also been timid and passive on the Ukrainian crisis. As I'm talking, Scholz is in Washington, or is on his way to Washington, for what looks like a dress down. Officials in Washington have been complaining that Scholz has switched to mute, and Germany's refusal to deliver weapons to Ukraine is causing frustration not only in Kyiv, but also among NATO members. Now, under Merkel, by contrast, Germany had been tough on Putin, and it had acted swiftly. When Russia invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014, Merkel had been proactive, and she had convinced all EU members, who were 28 at the time, to impose sanctions on Russia. Together with France, Germany had established the so-called Normandy format, which included Russia and Ukraine. Europe was at the negotiation table back then. Today, Putin talks directly with Biden over the heads of the Europeans. This is, of course, part of Russia's old practice of divide and rule when dealing with NATO. But Putin could not have ignored Merkel the way he is ignoring Scholz. Now, for Putin, Scholz is a more convenient interlocutor than Merkel, not only because he lacks her authority and gravitas, but also because he is a social democrat. Having grown up in East Germany, Merkel had no sympathy for Russia, to put it mildly. She was also strongly an Atlantist, like the rest of her party, the CDU. Germany's social democrats, by contrast, have historically been more favorably inclined towards Russia. Ever since Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik in the early 1970s, German social democrats have sometimes been dubbed Russlandversteher, or those who understand Russia. One who seems to understand Russia quite well is former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, a social democrat. He has been on Putin's payroll for years for chairing the consortium that built Nord Stream 1 and 2. Schroeder has recently accused Ukraine of, quote, saber rattling. In other words, he has been blaming Ukraine for the crisis. Now, it's true that Schroeder is no longer chancellor and that Willy Brandt sounds like ancient history, but concerns about Germany's new government when it comes to Russia are not unfounded. Recently, the government fired Vice Admiral Achim Sunbath, the head of the German Navy, for saying that the West should show Putin respect and recruit Russia as an ally against China. Now, although Sunbath was fired for his comments, he did express a sentiment shared by many decision makers in Germany. Indeed, the concept of Russlandversteher has been updated with that of Putinversteher, those who understand Putin. Now, from its refusal to supply weapons to Ukraine, to its insistence on building Nord Stream 2, a project that increases European dependence on Russia, on Russian natural gas and which was opposed by the United States, Germany is seen as not playing ball with the US and as undermining a united Western front against Putin. Now, of course, Nord Stream was built under Merkel, and therefore the Social Democrats alone cannot be blamed for narrowing Europe's margin of maneuver vis-à-vis Putin. And this margin is narrow precisely because Europe depends on Russia's natural gas. The EU can impose tougher sanctions on Russia, but theoretically, Putin can shut down the pipelines carrying Russian gas to the EU. Now, of course, the consequences would be unmanageable, especially in the winter, since the EU imports about 1/3 of its natural gas from Russia, and that's an average because for countries like Austria and Finland, it's 100%. But of course, turning off the gas tap would also be costly for Gazprom, and tough Western sanctions would hurt the Russian economy. But Russia would be able to hold on for quite a while, thanks to the $30 billion of reserves sitting in its central bank. And so far, by the way, Gazprom has made quite a lot of money thanks to the higher gas prices produced by the crisis. So it could be that maintaining the crisis without war is good enough for Putin. In any case, Germany poses a problem to the EU when it comes to natural gas because it consumes about a quarter of the EU's gas supplies, and because it has become more reliant still on natural gas since its decision to shut nuclear plants following the Fukushima disaster. But Germany is not the only reason why Putin is unlikely to face a united European response. France is a part of the problem too. There is no French equivalent for the German expression Russland verstehe, but there is definitely a French equivalent for the attitude. Indeed, former French Prime Minister Franois Fillon was recently added to Putin's payroll by joining the board of Sibur, Russia's petrochemicals giant. Unlike their German counterparts, the French conservatives are not unanimously Atlantist. Far from it. Fillon, who ran for president in 2017 as a Gaullist candidate, is a Russophile. Gaullist foreign policy was always about reducing French reliance on the United States. Hence did de Gaulle pull France out of NATO's military command in 1966. During the 2003 Iraq crisis, French President Jacques Chirac, himself a Gaullist, had castigated the governments of Eastern Europe, which were about to join the EU, for daring to show support for the United States, as France had built a united front against the war in Iraq with Russia and Germany. Now, Macron is not a Gaullist, although his foreign policy is by and large inspired by the Gaullist tradition. He has hardly contributed to showing a united front vis-a-vis Russia. 2 years ago, he called NATO brain dead and called for dialogue with Russia. Just like Chirac 2 decades ago, he's been floating the idea of a European army, something the Americans have always opposed, as an idea that risks undermining NATO. Now, Macron talks somewhat confusingly about a strategic autonomy, a typical French way of using coded language. But East European countries oppose the idea as much as the US does. And Macron's declarations and ideas on NATO have played into Putin's divide and rule tactics. Now, as I'm talking, Macron is in Moscow, or on his way to Moscow, to discuss Ukraine with Putin. But make no mistake, the French initiative is about buying time and about adding photo ops to the presidential campaign. France's presidential elections are in 2 months, and Macron cannot afford to go against French public opinion. And when it comes to Russia, French public opinion is split with strong Russian sympathies, transcend right and left. The presidential candidate for the center-right, Valérie Pécresse, is a moderate conservative who talks in bullet points. But the other contenders, with clear-cut views, both from right and left, have more sympathies towards Russia than towards the US. This includes Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour on the right, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon on the left. All 3 candidates, by the way, have committed to pull France out of NATO. So Putin, to conclude, Putin knows he can count on French public opinion and on French elections, but this will be over by late April. According to the Economist election model, Macron has a 79% chance of being re-elected. And if he is indeed, he'll get tougher on Russia, whether Putin invades Ukraine or not. At the beginning of his 5-year term, his term 5 years ago, Macron tried to impress Putin by inviting him to Versailles, establish personal relations, etc. Putin has mostly ignored Macron. And besides being disappointed, Macron has also been angered by the deployment of Russian mercenaries from the so-called Wagner group to Mali, where French troops are under pressure. Macron now calls Russia a destabilizing power, is attacking former Soviet republics with hybrid attacks, thus endangering Europe's security as well. Macron now warns of quote-unquote serious consequences if Russia invades Ukraine. He no longer wants to be accused of being too soft or even complicit with Moscow, or of dividing the EU or NATO. And besides the threat of economic sanctions, Macron has also deployed French troops to Romania to strengthen NATO's presence there. So my last point is that it looks like after Scholz's meeting with Biden and Macron's likely re-election in April, Paris and Berlin will get their acts together, be tougher on Putin, and be more in tune with Washington. This should help deter Putin and reach a compromise on Ukraine's relation with both NATO and the EU. Now, the Europeans surely remember what happens when you let an autocrat get away with grabbing territories, hoping that the last bite will be the last one. And if Putin gets away with conquering Ukraine, of course, Xi Jinping will feel confident about taking control of Taiwan. I think it's not too late for Paris, Berlin, and London to show a united front. The UK is no longer a member of the EU, but it is a member of NATO. And it is to be hoped that if and when they do so, it won't be too late for Ukraine and for Europe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. Now we have a few questions. We'll start with Russia. There is a question about Russian-Chinese relations. Can the Russians count on Chinese support, international support? Will this relationship survive the crisis? And finally, can you speculate on the flexibility of Putin on this crisis? Where there is room for compromise from his point of view?
I can take the question if that's okay. On the first question about China, we saw just recently in the last several days the joint statement issued by the Russian and Chinese governments between Putin and Xi Jinping. And it shows symbolic solidarity. I don't think the Kremlin is really expecting serious financial or military support from China. I think they can do just fine without it. I don't think they need it. The issue is that both Russia and China, in their own different ways, have concluded that the US-led global order has disadvantaged them. And that's one thing they can agree on. And that has serious implications. Our previous speaker, Emmanuel, mentioned Taiwan. China is certainly watching. And therefore, whatever happens in Ukraine will matter in the Asia Pacific as well. The conversation about Russia and China often tends to veer into an unhelpful discussion about whether the two will create a formal alliance. I think that there's plenty that they can do, and I think that's an unhelpful way of looking at it. They already have a strategic partnership, and that's plenty. And so in this sense, despite certain disagreements that you can find, there are agreements on the bigger issues. And on the second question, very briefly, can there be room for compromise? I mean, look, the issue is that Putin's demands are, they are non-starters. And what happens is when you have negotiations with someone who takes a maximalist position, it's very tempting to say, well, at least we didn't get the worst possible outcome. What worries me is that this is where you start making small concessions that will also have bigger implications. I think we need to move towards deterrence. What we need, and deterrence in this case will entail hard power, rather than making concessions, even if they might seem minor.
Okay, thank you. Oleksiy, there is a question for you. Can Ukraine count on the West? And somebody mentioned that is interested in you elaborating the point you made on the Balkans. And a third question for me, is Ukraine willing to consider what has been called the Finlandization?
Thank you. First question, whether Ukraine can count on the West, and I saw 2014 in brackets. First of all, the situation is quite, to put it softly, different what we saw in 2014, because neither Ukraine nor the West were prepared for such kind of actions by the Russian Federation. I can tell you personally that for us, for Ukrainians, it was something unthinkable that Russia can attack Ukraine militarily, and there were plenty of arguments to prove that it was unthinkable. And probably many Western leaders, if not all of them, who are born in a low-risk environment, were mentally ready to meet the challenge. Nowadays, as I said, there was an evolution, and Mr. Putin contributed a lot, not just to threatening Ukrainian nation, but also to make the West more united and to understand better what the Russian challenge and the real threat is. Just last week, I think Ukraine received something like few hundred tons of the Western diplomacy in the form of military equipment, including lethal weapons. So that's just one evidence. Germany highly criticized for its position for not providing Ukraine with lethal weapons and even blocking supplies from lethal weapons by other countries for Ukraine. Actually, one of the biggest supporters and biggest donors, Germany, during the last 8 years, provided something like €2 billion financial support for Ukraine. I mean, it's not military support, it's not about weapons, but still for a country at war, everything is considered as a contribution to its threatening its security. Diplomatic support. Last week, every day we had at least one visitor, either from Europe or from Turkey, from the United States. So Ukrainian government has enjoyed tremendous support, diplomatic, political support from its Western partners. Therefore, I'm pretty confident that Ukraine can count on Europe. And it is not about them loving Ukraine for whatever reasons. It's not about charity as it used to be some years ago. I think it's about their own national interests, and I believe to some extent about the principles and values. So that gives me more confidence in the Western support to be continued.
The Balkans.
Balkans. Let me make a kind of tell a bit of anecdotes. 3 years ago, when presidential election campaign in Ukraine, and one of the famous Russian journalists was asked about the most favorable name for the Russians, and he said the most favorable name for the next Ukrainian president is Mr. or Mrs. Chaos. chaos. This is what the Russian strongest weapon is, and this is the main objective that Russia is trying to achieve, either fighting Ukraine or in its global war against the West. And Bosnia and Herzegovina is one of the this weakest point and one of the very sensitive issues for Europe. I'm not going to give you a briefing about what is going on with the Republika Srpska and what kind of role is played by Serbia and the leaders supported over there, but there is definitely another potential hotspot. So, and Russia is actually putting fuel in this potential fire. Just to destabilize one reason after another, to create more and more problems, and then to offer its support, its help. So that's typical mafia approach. And there was another question about demography in Russia. I was not actually saying that Russia is interested in occupying territory for the sake of having more people, because the commentator was exactly right. In addition with the labor that or soldiers that can gain Russia, there are some pensioners. What they are now experienced with Crimea, occupied Crimea and part of Donbass. But during the last year and a half, Russia distributed 720,000 Russian passports in Donbass. That's official data from Russia. 720,000. And the miners and other people who are able to work from destroyed Donbass, they go to Russia to work there in Kuzbas and other places. And by doing this also, I mean, by distributing passports, Russian ruling party actually got something like, according to some estimates, 300,000 votes on the last presidential parliamentary elections in Russia. Any
Finlandization, will Ukraine consider?
This is a very interesting question about Finlandization. There are actually two parts of this question I like. First, yeah, that's exactly what Ukraine was asked by Russia, to put it softly, and by other partners. In 2010, Ukraine declared its non-bloc, which is actually neutral status. Did it help Ukraine in 2014 to be attacked? Let's put aside Budapest Memorandum. So Ukraine has learned already lessons about neutrality and external security guarantees provided by nuclear power and global powers like Russia. And even if European leaders, American leaders, or Moscow persuade any Ukrainian president to accept such an option, I'm afraid that he would probably have huge problems with the Ukrainian society, because it's already enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution. I mean, Euro-Atlantic strategic course. However, due to Mr. Putin's efforts, as you probably know, that some weeks ago, the Finland's president talked about the possibility to reconsider Finland's approach to possible NATO membership. It's still not popular in Finland, but I'm afraid that if Putin continues to do what he is doing, Sweden and Finland one day may change their mind with the support of the society. So if Finland becomes a NATO member, I would be very happy for Ukraine to accept this Finlandization model.
Okay, thank you, Eran. Just a short question. How do the Americans think they can deter Russia if they are committed to diplomacy only?
Well, there's clearly a significant tool in the form of sanctions. It's not trivial. I think the one difference between China and Russia is that at the end of the day, the Russian position is a kind of passive, aggressive, defensive. It's a country that's collapsing economically into itself. It has a huge military outlay, but it has an economy smaller than that of South Korea, smaller than that of Italy. You cannot really establish global hegemony on the basis of what Putin controls in terms of an economy. That's not the Chinese story. This is why Taiwan is in a very different league. It will be about world dominance. Ukraine is an important symbolic issue, but it is Russia's capability of actually moving ever forward is very limited. And if the US does impose a more aggressive system of sanctions, the consequences for Russia would not be trivial. So I think this is where the Biden administration has positioned itself. It would also use this, of course, to consolidate the position of NATO in the eastern flanks. It cannot deter the Russians from moving militarily by threatening to go to war, because that's the one misstep that may actually corner Putin into testing that proposition. There's very dangerous consequences for the Russians, for Ukraine, and for the world. So Biden has sent troops to Eastern Europe. He is willing to have arms being sent to Ukraine, but he will not commit to fight in the case of a Russian incursion.
Emmanuel, the last question to you. In light of the fear of an energy crisis in Europe, and there is rethinking in Europe about the EastMed Pipeline that could be an alternative to dependency upon Russia or Turkey.
Look, definitely one of the reasons why from the beginning, even the European Commission put some money for the feasibility study of the EastMed pipeline was part of the EU official policy of diversification of natural gas import to try and reduce European dependence on Russian gas. But as we know, there are many questions about how feasible this project is, especially economically. That's the main reason why it's being dropped, because it might not be economically feasible. There are other ways, by the way, to reduce European dependence on Russian gas. There are other avenues of importing gas, especially liquefied natural gas. But as I mentioned before, I think that one of the problems here is it's not only the problem of diversification in terms of imports, but also of electricity production. The fact that Germany made, in my opinion, the mistaken decision of closing down nuclear plants makes no sense, because especially it's in the framework of fighting global warming and meeting CO2 emissions. The most reliable source of energy is nuclear energy. It's very popular today in Europe to go only for renewable energies, but it's not sustainable. The current government in Germany, because of the coalition with the Green Party, is very into only renewables, but you cannot rely only on renewables. And I think that the crisis with Russia right now should be a wake-up call in Europe, especially in Germany, to rethink their hostility to nuclear energy.
We could have continued for much more time. I want to thank all the panelists, and I pass on the gavel to my colleague, Professor Eytan Gilboa, a senior researcher at the JISS. Eytan, please.
Thank you, Efraim. The previous speakers have talked about the importance of the Ukraine crisis, not just for the West, Russia, and the Ukraine itself. The crisis has significant implications for other countries and regions in the world. It may have important effects on the national security and foreign policy considerations and status of various countries. We see much diplomatic maneuvering in the last few days. Putin was in China just on Friday during the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics. Macron is now in Russia and will go tomorrow to the Ukraine. Prime Minister Bennett spoke the other day with President Biden about the situation in the Ukraine. And so everybody's watching the moves of the principal participants and consider the implications for its own situation. So in this panel, we will discuss the effects and implications for three countries, China, Turkey, and Israel. And we will have a concluding remarks about potential effects on the entire international system. So first, we'll talk about China, and our speaker is Tuvia Gering. He specializes in Chinese politics and foreign policy and emergency and disaster management. Tuvia, please.
Let's see, can you hear me? Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we
Yes,
do.
yes.
All right, and good night, of course, wherever you are. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'll discuss the Chinese point of view. In the first half, I'll show you what China and Russia want the rest of the world to see. And in the second, I'll discuss the hard reality of their relations vis-a-vis Ukraine and the West based on past, present, and future trends. So let's get started. So while the United States and its European and East Asian allies boycott the ongoing Beijing Winter Olympics due to human rights concern or ostensibly COVID, one world leader made sure that his appearance in the Bird's Nest Stadium was not missed by anyone. On the Chinese side, when Bloomberg reported, I think it was a week and a half ago, or 2 weeks ago, that China was concerned that the Russian invasion of Ukraine would steal their thunder, Chinese spokesperson dismissed the report as fake news intended to drive a wedge between China and Russia and undermine the Olympic success, right? So there's no crisis. What China and Russia want the world to see is that China-Russia relations are at their best time in history, according to Chinese ambassador to Russia, and they're heading in one direction only, that is forward. And I really like this quote by Vice Foreign Minister Eytan said after Xi and Putin's meeting last week. Just look at the high-profile interactions, except for that meeting, the summit. Just in the last week and a half, where leaders and diplomats and the entire propaganda apparatus of both countries mobilized to bolster each other's messages. So if we look at the authoritative comments in the Chinese media and state media, of course, a first element their messaging highlights is that the West pressures over Ukraine as it grows. Any attempt to drive a wedge between China and Russia's friendship is doomed to fail. This is exemplified through the bromance between Putin and Xi. In addition to their love of sports, both leaders are ethno-nationalists, have machoistic, paternalistic predilections, and a personal vendetta against sissy men. And on a less superficial level, Putin and Xi share similar challenges as strongman leaders for life, a position they both secured through strong political acumen and centralized control. More importantly, they are leaders of the world's most populated country and the world's largest country, respectively, by area. Both have 14 neighboring countries, and they share a border over 4,000 kilometers long. And both, of course, are under constant pressure from the West, with Biden describing Putin as a killer and Xi as a thug. This solid friendship, as they call it, is also manifested concretely through a genuine convergence of interests. On Friday, Putin and Xi signed 20 cooperation documents ranging from anything sports to COVID, vaccines, education, language. No, these days they're talking about building a joint base on the moon. Other examples include any fields, from strategy. Putin said that China and Russia will intensify their strategic communication and coordination. They are in the highest level of diplomatic relations between China in China's diplomatic system as comprehensive strategic partners, and then turned up to 11 of coordination for a new era. And then they often, the nationalists in China and Russia use the maxim that they're not allies, but better than allies. Of course, this is qualified by more serious analysts on both sides, but you get the picture. On energy, just to give you an example, last year, I think China imported about 50% increase in gas, a year-on-year increase. As for trade and investment, it was last year $140 billion, and it is expected to reach $200 billion in bilateral trade by 2024. In development cooperation, we can talk about infrastructure, for example. There are projects everywhere in the Russian Far East. You have the Baikal-Amur Railroad and Trans-Siberian Railway, global supply chains, etc., etc. And this development is not just bilateral, but also multilateral, international, through the Belt and Road Initiative of China, through the new Chinese initiative called the Global Development Initiative, GDI, and also through a Russian Eurasian Economic Union. And finally, security, just one word, Kazakhstan. They did not cooperate, but they did somewhat coordinate. I don't want to extend on that. I do want, however, to quote here Kadri Leak's essay from December that underlined that while it's true that Western sanctions following the annexation of Crimea in 2014 intensified the cooperation between China and Russia, it would be wrong to assume that the two countries were pushed together by the West. And because the West did not bring them together, it's not up for the West to split them apart. And that's important to highlight. A third message through authoritative statements and comments is that both countries are paragons of global stability, and Anna alluded to it in the first presentation, even alternatives for US-led Western order. So following the Putin-Xi summit, they published on Friday a joint statement, which the Vice Foreign Minister Liu Yicheng described as the most important political achievement of last week. Many nationalist Chinese praised the joint statement for directly criticizing NATO, the US, AUKUS members, Japan and others, arguing that it provides a clear critique of Western hegemony in terms of strategy, ideology, and practice. So again, what we see is China helping Russia divert global attention away from Ukraine. And let's take Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who sets the scene. We're in a period of changes unseen in a century, as I say, of the East rising and the West declining. The changes are accelerated by COVID. And while great power competition is not the theme of this world, what you do see is Sino-Russian attempts at pushing back against the US-led Western hegemony. More specifically, they are part of China's and Russia's goal to amend institution standards, norms, principles, values, all the things that we know that shape international order today in a way that conforms better with China's and Russia's interests and unconstrained by Western liberalist evangelism. For example, they mentioned that sadly attempts by a number of countries to politicize sports for their self-interest, NATO, Cold War remnant, bloc politics, same thing they said about AUKUS. In the meantime, Russia and China are presented as oceans, as islands of stability in an ocean of chaos. They are models of true multilateralism, a new type of major powers relations. Both play a crucial role in stabilizing the global order. And while they're not revisionist of global order per se, China and Russia are reconstructionist of what they perceive as a biased global order in favor of US-led Western hegemony. By co-opting the existing international organizations and redefining internationally accepted values like human rights or democracy, for example, as you see here, they wish to rearrange the Jenga tower of global order without letting it collapse. Whether they envision the same global order is a different question. For instance, China and Russia have different interpretation of what security means. Anyway, Putin said that Russia and China are free of the vestiges of the past, okay? Talking about the past perspective. Of course, he's referring to the Sino-Soviet split. That was the first alliance between China and Russia that ended poorly for two sides, culminating in a bloody battle on the borders and lasting until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if we stroll further down memory lane, Chinese nationalists will never forget Stalin's pivotal role in ensuring that the state of Mongolia today does not share the fate of China's autonomous region of Inner Mongolia. And you know, instead of a beautiful crabapple leaf, it looks kind of like this today. And on the Russian side, you hear similar voices. There is some alarm about Beijing's strong arming of its smaller neighbors and its revanchism on the Russian Far East. So that's something to look forward to. And the last point about the future. First point I'd like to emphasize is, as said earlier, sanctions do work, Iran said. In an interview with TASS, the Russian news agency, Igor Denisov quoted the Director General of Russian International Affairs Council, Andrei Kortunov, which argued that Chinese private banks and companies have always followed US sanctions because they did not want to become the target of extraterritorial secondary sanctions. And indeed, after Crimea, Chinese state-owned companies were not eager to break the Western sanctions. And when they do invest, they drive a tough bargain. Another point is some have argued that Russian aggression emboldens China's expensive territorial claims, but all things equal, with COVID, socioeconomic challenges, and the US pressure, of course, the last thing that China needs right now is international conflict in Ukraine. And another point is that both China and Russia want to revamp the global order, as established earlier, but they have diverging interests on many topics. So security, as I said, and other fields like law of the sea, the Arctic, and so on. And what's not going to change, and that's almost certain, is that their mutual strategic need of each other. And another thing, despite their rhetoric, both China and Russia need the West for economic growth and solving global challenges. They can't live without them. And finally, a word about Taiwan, since it's always mentioned about this topic. I see many comparisons between Taiwan and Ukraine, and some analysts have linked their fates, even said that a successful Russian invasion would harm US credibility. However, I agree mostly with Karis Tempelman that argued that the differences outweigh the similarities. And here I compiled a little chart to help us illustrate the point. Just take a quick gander and see the major differences, and you can take a print screen if you like. And that's the main point I'd like to say about that. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Tuvia. I need to mention that all the speakers in this panel are affiliated with the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. We move now from China to Turkey. Erdogan suggested to be a mediator. He invited Russia and the Ukraine for a peace conference in Turkey. It was reported that he delivered drones to the Ukraine. So we want to speak now about Turkey. And our speaker is Dr. Eytan Cohen Yanarocak. He is an expert on contemporary Turkish politics and foreign policy, Turkish-Israeli relations, and the Kurds. He's co-editor of Turkey Scope, published by the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. Hi, Eytan, please.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Well, first of all, I would like to mention that the timing of this standoff is really crucial for Turkey, and it is preferable because let me remind you, only last year Turkey was heading the NATO's very high readiness joint task force, meaning that in this kind of a scenario, if this today's scenario was taking place last year, Turkey had to be responsible for spearheading this whole NATO initiative against Russia. Therefore, from Turkey's perspective, the decision makers in Ankara can now have a deeper breath. But still, since Russia is considered as the historical nemesis of Turkey, or in other words, of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey still feels itself between the hammer and the anvil. And the most important issue here is, of course, Turkish national security in the Black Sea. Today, Turkey desires a strong Ukraine in the Black Sea in order to diminish the Russian naval influence. But in case of a invasion of Ukraine, so Turkey will be threatened in the very near future by a more serious Russian threat. And besides that, Turkey, nowadays we all know that Turkey's membership in NATO is questioned by the allies itself. Let us not forget that Turkey is also sitting on the straits of Dardanelles and Straits of Istanbul, which means that in case of a full-scale war between Russia and NATO, Turkey's allies would like to use these straits in order to send their navies to the Black Sea. And this will create a huge problem, because then Turkey should basically decide whether it is a Black Sea coastal state and as a good partner of Russia, or is it an ally of the West. We all know that the belligerent states can send ships through the straits if they are on the side of the Turkish government. But otherwise, if Turks will remain neutral, then Turkey has to basically close the straits to the non-Black Sea countries, which will be a huge challenge for Turkey. Besides that, for Turkey, there is another important concern. Turkey would like to see the maintenance of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, not because of the fact that the Turkish decision makers became Ukrainian nationalists. It is because this will create a precedent, and not only in Ukraine, but it will also create a precedent in Nagorno-Karabakh, because at the end of the day, the Russian justification for annexing the Ukrainian territories is based on the civilian population, meaning that such a precedent in the Turkish eyes will pave the way for the Armenian annexation of some of the parts of Nagorno-Karabakh. Moreover, it will create another important precedent also for the Kurds in Syria. So in Turkish eyes, Turks would not like to see a change in the status quo. And if we are speaking about minorities, of course, from the Turkish point of view, I also would like to mention about the Tatars. The Tatars were considered as the continuation of once upon a time let's say, an ex-Ottoman community. And during the 18th century, this particular community, the Tatars, had their own state in Crimea. And it was 1783 when the Russians annexed Crimea. And during the Second World War days, these people approximately constituted the half of the population of Crimea. Only because of Joseph Stalin, they were sent to exile, and today their population stands approximately like 11%. So Turkey would like to preserve their status. This is also very crucial for Turkey. Besides that, Turkey is giving another important. Turkey is collaborating with Russia and in Ukraine in the defense sectors. We all know that Russia is building the Turkish nuclear power plant. Russia sold to Turkey S-400 anti-ballistic systems, and besides that, Russia is also considered as Turkey's partner in the field of energy. We have two important pipelines, the Blue Stream and the Turk Stream, which basically strengthens the interdependency between the two countries. So at one hand, we have this strong Russian-Turkish partnership, but on the other hand, we also see that the Turks are also engaging with the Ukrainian defense industry sector. And recently, Mr. Erdogan paid a visit to Kyiv, and there he signed another important agreement with his Ukrainian counterpart, with Zelensky. Both of the countries signed a free trade agreement, and they would like to boost their partnership, especially on the defense industry. We all know that in 2019, Turkey already dispatched 6 UAVs, 6 Bayraktar UAVs to Ukraine, and these were operational. And according to the military sources, these were all used in the Donbass region. And besides that, recently the Ukrainian firm called Motor Sich, they declared that they are going to provide to Turkish Baykar firm, which this the same particular firm is producing the Bayraktar UAVs, the necessary engines. This is crucial because we are also seeing that because of the equipment of the S-400 anti-ballistic systems from Russia, we all witnessed that the American administration imposed Kaatsa sanctions against Turkey. So Turkey began to look for an important military technological supplier in order to fill this vacuum. And of course, with its technology, the Ukrainians are providing a very, they are playing a very important role here. Besides that, the two countries also agreed that Turkey will inaugurate a new factory for producing the Bayraktar UAVs on the Ukrainian soil. This is again very important. And as far as I understand, the two countries will proceed by conducting technological transfer and mutual production. Okay, and besides that, nowadays we are seeing that Mr. Erdogan is very much eager to be the mediator between the two leaders. I would like to emphasize here that if Erdogan, I mean, let us enter to the shoes of Mr. Erdogan. How would you persuade Mr. Putin? Because Putin's hand is stronger than Zelensky, right? So from my perspective, now I am thinking out loud and I'm trying to be as creative as I can. If I was Mr. Erdogan, I was looking at the bigger picture and I could basically see the most important friction points between Turkey and Russia. So what are these friction points? It is Libya, it is Syria's Idlib, it is Nagorno-Karabakh, and of course it is the Black Sea. So in order to strengthen the bargaining power of Mr. Zelensky, maybe Mr. Erdogan would offer something in return to Mr. Putin, and then Mr. Erdogan would deduct the price of this nice gesture by having more and more support from the Ukrainian military industry. So this is how I thought out loud. We will see if Mr. Putin will answer to the calls of Mr. Erdogan, but we'll see if Turkey will be able to put an end to this tension, because from Turkey's perspective, this is really jeopardizing its own interests. Turkey doesn't want to find itself between Russia and the West, and basically it doesn't want to prove to all sides that it is a partner and it is an ally of these states. So we'll see what will happen. Thank you very much for having me. If you have any questions, of course, I will be glad to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eitan. The next issue is Israel. In Israel, we are watching very carefully what is happening in the Ukraine, because the outcome may have significant implications for the entire region. So we're talking about implications for Israel. The speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Reserve Daniel Rakov, who initiated and organized this conference. He is an expert on Russian policy and great power competition in the Middle East. He had served in the Israeli Defense Forces intelligence branch for more than 20 years. Daniel, please.
Thank you, Eitan. I'm happy to be here. I think that's one of the most deep discussions we had in Israel with a good expertise and interesting points of view. And I will speak about the Israeli perspective. And I think that the main issue to consider here is that Israel is here before a dilemma, before a realistic posture, and it's hearts and minds. And in hearts and minds, Israel is completely with the Western camp and with the Ukraine. And our official position of considering this crisis is that we are fully with Ukraine. We support Ukrainian territorial integrity. We don't support the annexation of Crimea. And we would like to see free, independent, pluralistic, democratic Ukraine. We have good relations with Ukraine, have a big, lot of Ukrainian originated people, Jews living here in Israel. I'm one of them. And I think there is a similarity between the historic path that Israel went and Ukraine. Both of our countries had to reinvent their national identity. Israel 70 years ago, and Ukraine the last 30 years, as it was for hundreds of years, it wasn't an independent country. And on the other hand, there is an important, and I should mention that Israel is fully integrated with the Western camp. The United States is our main national security pillar, and the European Union is our good partners. And on the other hand, the realistic paradigm is that we have an important relationship with Russia also, both because of the historical circumstances and because since 2015, we have Russia as our neighbor, immediate neighbor in our northern border, after Russia has intervened into the Syrian civil war. And many important issues in our national security are dependent on cooperation with Russia. We have a common ground with Russia. So, in current time, the Ukrainian, this crisis around the Ukraine is a bad timing for Israel because it is concurrent with the negotiations in Vienna, considering the JCPOA, and Israel considers this issue of the international limitations on Iranian nuclear program to be an existential issue for it. And this is these weeks are a moment of truth. What will happen that it will set this next limitations on Iran for several years. And we also have a common border with Iran, the same northern border, and Russia is also having an important balancing position between Israel, Iran, Hezbollah, Syrian regime, and Israel sees its very important relationship in order to have a freedom of military action in the northern front. So, and during these weeks, we have seen Russia signaling to Israel, and I think this signaling is both for Israel and both for the Western powers around Syria, that trying to restrain Israeli freedom of action and to try to deter the West. We've seen GPS jamming from Syrian soil, which influence most of the northern part and central part of Israel. We've seen the land and aerial patrols of Russian army with the Syrians. And I think it signifies the tension in the air that Israel has to consider. Also, we have more naval forces deployed. Russia have deployed about 10 ships this week to the Eastern Mediterranean, and it is the biggest military deployment, I think, that we've seen in years. And if those ships will go to the Black Sea, it will be the biggest military naval deployment by Russian Federation in the Black Sea for decades. So this more Russian deployment brings more Western deployment. So Eastern Mediterranean is quite a tense place currently. So this dilemma brings Israel brought Israel to the solution for many years to try to be low profile on the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, but to continue good and friendly ties with Ukraine and try to facilitate behind the scene. And we've seen that during the recent several months, it was published that President Zelensky from Ukraine asked our Prime Minister Naftali Bennett to try to organize a summit between Zelensky and President Putin in Israel, and it was published that the message was brought to the ears of the Russian president, but the Russians didn't agree. And I think that it signifies the essence of this conflict, because it's not a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and as it was mentioned by previous speakers, it's a conflict about a world order, and Russia is trying to speak above the head of the Ukrainians with the United States, mostly, and with the European Union, and it's a little bit similar with what President Erdogan was doing. He's trying to facilitate, but President Putin doesn't need his facilitation because he tries to pressure Ukraine, and he doesn't need anybody to facilitate his ability to speak. I think that if he would like to speak to Zelensky, they have a common language and many channels to convey their messages. Still, if we're asked by the Ukrainians to convey such a message, we should do it, and this is our obligation. And this is the least we can do because of our friendly relationship with Ukraine and our understanding of the graveness of the situation. And this position Israel played with a low-profile public position on the crisis, in the recent weeks, it came into problem, I think, and it's not a dead end, but we had some kind of debate between the Ukrainian officials and our foreign minister. The Ukrainian ambassador criticized our foreign minister Yair Lapid, who is planned to become a new prime minister because he's not talking enough to Ukraine and he's talking too much with Russia. And he also said, Prime Minister Lapid, that he thinks that the crisis will end without a war. Also, the Ukrainian foreign minister in Israeli television asked Israel for a military help, which is a sensitive issue vis-a-vis Russia. What Israel should do? I think that Israel must understand the severity of the situation. I think that the previous speakers, especially Oleksiy and Anna, have emphasized that war is quite possible. Maybe not the full-scale war, but physically, the Russian army is capable to, I think, to conquer big chunks of the Ukrainian territory, and this is something which might happen, and this is something to consider. I think that our Western partners do not voice those considerations because they're hysterical. I think this is the situation on the ground they see. So there are several possibilities of the situation to unfold. I think there is a possibility of war, there is a possibility of diplomatic process, there's a possibility of prolonged crisis. We don't have to end this crisis in several weeks. And each of those possibilities brings before Israel different threats and opportunities. I think that if the war is the worst crisis scenario, because also because of its direct consequences, but also because almost instantaneously, I think sanctions would be put on Russia and Israeli economic interest will be threatened. I think also vis-a-vis Russia. I think also Israel is going to be under cross pressures from Russia to continue its friendly relationship with Russia, and from the West to be publicly inside the Western coalition, trying to isolate and put price on Russian activity in Ukraine. Also, there is a possibility of military realignment in the Middle East. If Ukraine, Russia is going to be a more significant military threat for the United States, and there is a possibility that some boots will leave the Middle Eastern ground and travel to the European front, and this might put our region to more instability. Russia will try to, in any case, to portray the United States and the West as being unreliable partner, and it will serve a blow to their power, image of power, which is not in our interest. And if it will happen, Russia will be considered by the local actors in the Middle East as more important world power, and it might bring Russia in other fields of importance for Israel. So therefore, I think that the opportunities we'll have is to strengthen our relationship with our Western partners. We will have a possibility to learn, the military have the possibility to learn a lot about a confrontation between big armies, world armies, which is something which don't have possibility in our area. There is new possibilities, new opportunities vis-a-vis Turkey. There is the gas issue was raised. Israel must prepare for a possibility that there is going to be a new wave of Jewish immigration from Israel, from Ukraine, if there is a crisis. If I will have to summarize and give some recommendations to the Israeli government, is first to understand the graveness of the situation. Second, I think that despite as frustrating is going to be to our Ukrainian and Western partners, I think this obscure Israeli position is best, is serving its best vis-a-vis the different interests it has. It must play behind the scenes and to be helpful both for the West and the Ukrainians. And we must have a contingency planning for different paths that is going to happen in several weeks or months. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. We move now to possible effects of the crisis on the entire international system. And our speaker is Professor Efraim Inbar, who is president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and for Security and Strategy and Security. He taught international relations at Bar-Ilan University and was the founding director for many years of the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. Was educated, got his graduate degrees from the University of Chicago. Efraim, please.
Thank you. Indeed, I think that we see a collision of values and worldviews. And I think the appropriate title for my presentation is Liberal Thinking Faces Reality. This is an opportunity indeed for everybody to understand what's really going on in the world and not to live on idealistic models. First, observation is that military force is still useful. The Russians wanted for years the Americans to listen to their security concerns, and it didn't help them. When they started concentrating forces along the borders of Ukraine, they received from Washington a dialogue that discusses their security concerns. I think also that we should realize again that fear is still a power factor in international relations. Thucydides was right in mentioning that fear is an important factor. And I think many people in the West do not realize that Russia is afraid. We have to remember its historic sensibilities. Russia is afraid of NATO and the EU eastward expansion, is afraid of Western support for the color revolutions in its former Soviet Union republics. By the way, it's not that very different from the Monroe Doctrine that was result of American similar sensibilities in the Western Hemisphere. This crisis introduced by Russia, old notions such as buffer zones, spheres of influence, which liberal thinking has dismissed as outdated. But maybe exactly this type of notions could be the road to a resolution of the conflict. The Ukraine crisis reminds us also of the limits of diplomacy. In my view, the US only emboldened Russia by reiterating its commitment to solve the crisis by diplomatic measures only. Diplomacy, as we know in many cases, is hardly effective without being backed by a credible military option. And without a credible military option, it would be very difficult for the United States to create a potent deterrent. I would like to point out also that Ukraine is the first test after Afghanistan. Big international test. We see a reluctant US to use force, which only reinforces its image of a US in decline. I think many read this crisis in such a way. US could leap out of its lethargy and act forcefully like in the past. It might surprise us. I believe maybe the United States has the ingredients for being the United States. But the world doesn't think in such terms. Such scenarios of a more muscular United States are not seen as likely. And perception drives resolutions. What America does in this crisis will have great consequences. Of course, in Europe, it is the first real test of NATO after the end of the Cold War. Putin challenges the current European security structure. If successful, and we don't know yet how this crisis will end, what will happen to the Baltic states? Will NATO survive when it will be proved as inefficient, as unreliable? Will Europe put its act together and start allocating enough money for defense? A thing that it was reluctant to do for many years. This crisis obviously shows that Europe still needs an American umbrella. Another point concerns the Middle East. It was also already mentioned by Daniel that there are talks in Vienna, in Europe, about the Iranian nuclear program. Additional US weakness, perceived US weakness, will embolden further Iran. They see already a weak America. They see already an America desperate to get a deal. I think that if US is not seen as a strong power vis-a-vis Russia in Ukraine, it will clearly affect the Iranian willingness to make concessions, minimum concessions, to please the Americans. Will the Ukraine crisis accelerate the plans of Israel to strike Iran? If Washington is weak, maybe the Israelis can ignore some of their warnings. There may be a Middle East escalation. Also about Turkey. Turkey, as Chai rightly mentioned, is not a faithful member of NATO. If the Russians come with the upper hand, will they bandwagon toward Russia even furthermore? It may well happen. Of course, the other arena, which is also mentioned, is China. Probably the Taiwan case is different from the Ukraine case in many ways. But if Russia is winning the Ukraine crisis, what will be the perception in Beijing? Will they be deterred by US threats? We don't know. We don't know what's happening in the heads of the leaders in those autocratic regimes. Will Japan look again at its alliance with the United States if Russia and China are aligned together? This is a possibility. The Ukraine crisis also demonstrates the futility of international relations. To remind you, and I don't want to elaborate on that, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum assured Ukraine, also Kazakhstan and Belarus, that Russia, United States, and the UK will guarantee their territorial integrity and will fend off any threats to their territorial integrity. This didn't happen when Crimea was swallowed by the Russians, and I doubt very much if it will happen with this crisis. The crisis also demonstrates the failure of international institutions. I want to remind you that the Americans went to the United Nations Security Council to complain about Russia, knowing well that Russia has a veto power and they will never get a resolution against Russia. And even if they get one, what will it help? I think this crisis is a challenge to liberal thinking. And in the West, they should do their homework. They should learn their lessons. Their notions of what the international system consists of needs drastic rethinking. The final point which I make, and this is more of a speculation, I was reminded of Kissinger moves vis-a-vis China in the 70s. Maybe the US missed an opportunity for a grand deal with Russia to bring over the Russians against China and to allow the Russians to rejoin the Western civilization. Russia's literature, Russia's music, Russia's ballet, and I love Russian ballet, is part of Western culture. It's literature, it's part of Western culture. Maybe this was an opportunity lost. And I would like to, to end reminding our audience, that probably the Ukrainians realize now that we still live in a Hobbesian world, where every state is on its own. And life is often solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Efraim. We have a few minutes for questions. I have two questions that indeed were raised by Efraim as questions. Maybe we can get some answers. And the questions are on military opportunities. So if Putin were to invade the Ukraine, how this would affect the situation between China and Taiwan? This is for Tuvia. Would this encourage China to use force to bring back Taiwan into the Chinese mainland?
All right, thank you. So let's quote Russia's ambassador to China, Denisov, who said, I think was in September last year, or no, it was June last year, to the Global Times, that this question is irrelevant because a crisis is never going to happen. There's not going to be an invasion of Ukraine. And because of that, there's not going to be an invasion of Taiwan, because both, or not both, but all parties involved understand that the consequences would mean the end of humanity, as he described it, Denisov. And that's an important thing to highlight. While it may appear that China will become emboldened by any Russian invasion of Ukraine, first it goes against its principle of non-interference. The optics are very bad for China if its comprehensive strategic partner of coordination for a new era invades a sovereign country and takes it as their own. And of course, the economic consequences are going to be devastating. So a question about Taiwan, and the assurances and credibility of the US are less relevant, also considering the historic reasons I showed in the presentations. You got the Taiwan Relations Act, you got Biden, going back on the strategic ambiguity that made relations with China possible in the first place between China and the US. And twice, not once, he said that yes, and yes, we are going to help Taiwan defend themselves. And it's understood by all involved, and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also emphasized that last week or 2 weeks ago, that Taiwan is a completely different story. No, I don't think that Russia will be happy for Russia to invade Ukraine, and no, I don't think it will affect Taiwan. As a matter of fact, Taiwan itself has similar reactions to Ukraine as China. Surprisingly, they parrot almost exactly the same line that Chinese official media says, is pointed out also by Igor Denisov. And so it's very interesting. So I think it's simplification. I think Anna also mentioned that. I don't think it's like.
Okay, thank you. We have a similar question about Israel. So this is the question. Would Israel use the opportunity if Putin invades the Ukraine to attack the Iranian nuclear facilities? Daniel?
Thank you. I think it's not connected. I think that if Israel would like to attack the Iranian nuclear facilities, it would have done so beforehand. I don't think that it is relevant, and it doesn't need the great powers to fight each other to have this opportunity. I think that it is important for Israel that currently Russia has an important role in the negotiation and in mediating between Iran and the United States and the European powers. And also there is an importance that if United States and the European Union have to concentrate, have to focus on the European arena, their ability to stand firm in front of Iran when they would like to end the negotiation is weakened. But I don't see any new Israeli attack on Iran.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Eitan. The question to you is this, number one, how the crisis in the Ukraine could affect Turkish hegemonial aspirations in the Middle East? And the second question is about the rapprochement that seems to emerge in Turkish policy and attitude toward Israel.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, Turkey seeks to differentiate the baskets from each other. Turkey is for Russia, Syria, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, and other parts are pretty different. But when it comes to Black Sea, from the Turkish eyes, it is a border. It's a naval border with Russia, and therefore Turkey doesn't want to see any change in the status quo in the Black Sea. But when we are speaking about the Middle East, well, Turkey is very much concerned that Russia may use the Idlib card in order to create a refugee influx into Turkey. And therefore, in this regard, the United States and the European Union should basically stand next to Turkey in a very firm manner. Otherwise, Turkey will not be able to cope with this Russian threat. Basically, it will be like a sandwich between the Black Sea and Syria. So from Turkey's perspective, Turkey would like to see a stronger Ukraine. Turkey would like to see the continuation of the status quo. This is for the Middle East. And your second question, please remind me that you told me that the rapprochement between Turkey and Israel, right?
Yes.
Turkey is mending its fences with Israel. This is not a connecting issue with the Ukraine standoff. It is because of the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey isolated itself with this, from my perspective, the irrational foreign policy doctrine they called precious loneliness. And nowadays they are making a U-turn. They are trying to mend fences with Egypt. They already did with the United Arab Emirates. I think the Israeli Turkish rapprochement is pretty much stems from the Emirati pressure. We should all remember that Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan decided to invest in Turkey $10 billion. In other words, he bought the Turkish foreign policy's tendency. So from my perspective, this is very much related to the Emirati intervention, and also because of Turkey's desire to mend fences with the United States. This is totally not related with Russia or Ukraine.
Thank you. Fine. This is a few questions for you. Domestic situation in the United States. Number one, to what extent the corruption in the Ukraine influence in any way Biden's decisions? Number two is to what extent his soft policy toward the crisis would affect the congressional elections in 2022. And I got a Jewish question. We cannot end this conference without a Jewish question. So the question is, how the fact that Zelensky's two parents are Jewish also are affecting the situation?
To me, the question?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
I'll address only the Jewish question. I think that Eran is better qualified to answer the question about the United States. But frankly, I don't think that the fact that the president of Ukraine is Jewish has any importance. Putin is seeing Ukraine as one unit, and he doesn't care if at its head is a Jew, a Catholic, or whatever. So he sees the land of Ukraine, doesn't matter what the people at the top are. It is not important. And maybe Eran will answer about the midterm elections.
Well, two things. First of all, as you may recall, there was an accusation about that the Trump side in the previous presidential election tried to bring up against the Biden family, basically Biden's son and his Ukrainian connections, and it led to perjury issues, and the former ambassador is now suing the government, the Trump side. There are legacies there that may be dragged up by the Trump connection with the Ukrainian crisis, basically in order to. But I doubt if there's anything. This has anything to do with Biden's dilemma in Ukraine right now, which has to do with much broader issues. The midterm election does pose a challenge because the Republicans will use any sign of perceived weakness, hesitation, confusion, things that Biden should not have said, like this reference to a minor incursion. They're all going to be part of their ammunition in the effort to gain the majority in both houses of Congress, which would definitely put Biden in a very, very difficult situation if that happens in November. At the end of the day, of course, as usual, it will be decided on American domestic issues, economic issues, the growing inflation, perceptions of Biden's social and economic orientation. But the image of weakness or confusion in international affairs will be used by the Republicans, and it's already being used. Paradoxically, they're saying we are giving Biden full backing, but on condition that he takes a very hard line against Russia. That's a way of exonerating the Republicans from the accusation that they were stooges of Putin in the 2016 election. But it puts Biden in an even more complicated situation than he would have been anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks to all the speakers in this panel. Efraim, the floor is back to you.
Okay, thank you to our audience. And I hope we'll all see you again at another webinar. And we bid you shalom from Jerusalem.